Good morning, everybody. It is good to, I was going to say it's good to see all of you out there. I don't know that I can call our group today all. I mean, you're all here that are here, but I just thought it was funny that for, I don't know, what was it, 4 or 5 Sundays, we had that group of Korean exchange students, and no one will sit in their spot now. It's just permanently vacant. Like, I don't know what we're going to do about that. Anyhow, today we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 7. Which is one of these passages I kind of wasn't looking forward to preaching because it's long and technical, but we'll get there. You can have your Bibles open there. We'll read it together in just a minute. You know, there are lots of things in our everyday life which we probably use regularly, and we have really basically no idea how they even work. Like, how many of us actually understand how a smartphone or a laptop works and what makes it go, or how it connects to Wi-Fi or data that's just like out there in the atmosphere. So, like, we use them all the time, or how a car works. I mean, I have this memory of when I was a teenager working on this old 1968 Pontiac with my grandfather. We were changing the spark plugs. My grandpa did his side. It was a V8 engine, so it's got 4 spark plugs on each side. Grandpa had his changed with no trouble light, just doing it by feel before I had. But you could at least kind of understand how an old vehicle like that worked. I mean, the hood was big enough you could get inside it and stand beside the engine, right? I opened the hood on the new car that we have now. I'm like, there's a whole other hood under the hood. I can't even see the motor under here. I used to do all my oil changes myself. I'm like, I'm not doing that anymore. Who knows even where you do anything on this, right? But we still drive it. It still gets us from place to place, but I have no idea how all those electronics work. It just seems that things are becoming more and more complicated as they become more and more automated. Of course, there are still experts who could explain to you how a smartphone works, how a dual clutch automatic transmission or a traction control system works, but it's very technical knowledge, right? It's not something that's easy to grasp for the average person, and it takes a long time to understand that, so most of us just use the thing without really understanding that much about it. And I feel kind of like this with Hebrews chapter 7. Like, I feel like I am just scratching the surface of this, and in trying to explain all the things that we're going to look at, I feel a bit like I'm trying to explain how an automatic transmission on a car works to somebody that's never seen a car before. But we'll do our best right here. It's just that this is kind of dense, and it's all the stuff about the sacrifices, and even the way, as we're going to see, the author kind of argues this case, it's really quite foreign to us. So instead of kind of trying to go for this deep and very technical understanding, I'm hoping we can kind of hit some of the high points and main themes of this passage and come away with that, and not get lost in the weeds, but unpack what's most necessary for us. So I'd invite you to stand, and we'll read Hebrews chapter 7 together, and then we'll kind of jump in and hit some of those high points, like I said. So Hebrews 7, well, actually, I'll start it. I don't think it's on the screen, but I'll start at 6 verse 20. Jesus has already gone in there into the inner sanctuary for us. He has become our eternal high priest in the order of Melchizedek. This Melchizedek was king of the city of Salem and also a priest of God Most High. When Abraham was returning home after winning a great battle against the kings, Melchizedek met him and blessed him. Then Abraham took 1/10 of all that he had captured in battle and gave it to Melchizedek. The name Melchizedek means king of justice, and king of Salem means king of peace. There is no record of his father or mother or any of his ancestors, no beginning or end to his life. He remains a priest forever, resembling the Son of God. Consider then how great this Melchizedek was. Even Abraham, the great patriarch of Israel, recognized this by giving him 1/10 of what he had taken in battle. Now the law of Moses required that the priests, who are descendants of Levi, must collect a tithe from the rest of the people of Israel, who are also descendants of Abraham. But Melchizedek, who was not a descendant of Levi, collected 1/10 from Abraham. And Melchizedek placed a blessing upon Abraham, the one who had already received the promises of God. And without question, the person who has the power to give a blessing is greater than the one who is blessed. The priests who collect tithes are men who die. So Melchizedek is greater than they are because we are told that he lives on. In addition, we might even say that these Levites, the ones who collect the tithe, paid a tithe to Melchizedek when their ancestor Abraham paid a tithe to him. For although Levi wasn't born yet, the seed from which he came was in Abraham's body when Melchizedek collected the tithe from him. So if the priesthood of Levi, on which the law was based, could have achieved the perfection God intended, why did God need to establish a different priesthood with a priest in the order of Melchizedek instead of the order of Levi and Aaron? And if the priesthood is changed, the law must also be changed to permit it. For the priest we are talking about belongs to a different tribe whose members have never served at the altar as priests. What I mean is, our Lord came from the tribe of Judah, and Moses never mentioned priests coming from that tribe. This change has been made very clear since a different priest, who is like Melchizedek, has appeared. Jesus became a priest not by meeting the physical requirement of belonging to the tribe of Levi, but by the power of a life that cannot be destroyed. And the psalmist pointed this out when he prophesied, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Yes, the old requirement about the priesthood was set aside because it was weak and useless, for the law never made anything perfect. But now we have confidence in a better hope through which we draw near to God. This new system was established with a solemn oath. Aaron's descendants became priests without such an oath, but there was an oath regarding Jesus, for God said to him, "The Lord has taken an oath and will not break his vow. You are a priest forever." Because of this oath, Jesus is the one who guarantees this better covenant with God. There were many priests under the old system, for death prevented them from remaining in office. But because Jesus lives forever, his priesthood lasts forever. Therefore, he is able to save once and forever those who come to God through him. He lives forever to intercede with God on their behalf. He is the kind of high priest we need because he is holy and blameless, unstained by sin. He has been set apart from sinners and has been given the highest place of honor in heaven. Unlike those other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices every day. They did this for their own sins first and then for the sins of the people. But Jesus did this once and for all when he offered himself as the sacrifice for the people's sins. The law appointed high priests who were limited by human weakness, but after the law was given, God appointed his Son with an oath, and his Son has been made the perfect high priest forever. This is the word of the Lord. You can be seated. Okay, so there's a lot to cover there, and like I said, we're not going to, dig deep down into everything and kind of get lost in the weeds and the technicality of some things. We want to sort of look at the big picture here. We have to start with the understanding that Psalm 110 is the main Old Testament passage that the writer of Hebrews kind of bases everything upon, right? Where the promise is made, you'll be a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek and sits at the right hand of God. These are two huge facts that the writer of Hebrews just comes back to again and again and again and again, which right there is not what we would probably naturally go for. If someone was to say, like, where in the Old Testament does it talk about what Jesus will do for us, right, in being the sacrifice for our sins? I suspect if most of us had any thought of that, we would probably go to something like Isaiah, the 53, the suffering servant. He was wounded for our transgressions. That tends to be, I think, where most of us would go. Psalm 110 just seems very obscure, and it's not something that we would probably naturally gravitate to. So we have to kind of understand, he's already working on kind of different wavelength than we would. But Psalm 110 is the big picture passage for this whole book. And kind of today we really dig into the why this is such an important passage for him. There are about 8 million bunny trails we could go down here, but we will stick to the main point. And the main point here that so seems to fascinate the writer of Hebrews is that it describes in Psalm 110 someone who is going to come and save Israel, who is both a king and a priest. And that seems just so central and so important to him in understanding who Jesus is, that he just keeps coming back to it again and again and kind of saying like, look, it was there in the Old Testament all along. One was going to come, Messiah was going to come, who would be king and priest. And he is said to exercise both of these roles from the place of honor at the right hand of God, and he's said to exercise them perpetually, forever. And this is kind of the whole argument of the book of Hebrews. He just keeps unpacking this from different angles. So given this Old Testament text, right away we have another Old Testament text to deal with. Psalm 110 mentions someone called Melchizedek. And you can be forgiven if you have really no idea who this person even is. Last week, if you were here with us, we talked a bit about Father Abraham, who was called by God to be the founder of the nation that would become Israel. And Israel's purpose was to glorify God and point others to him. We find Abraham's story in Genesis chapters 12 to 25. So way back in the beginning, at the very ancient times, the beginning of kind of what we would call recorded history, right? Abraham comes on the scene. God starts interacting with people in a new way. He calls Abraham to be the founder of this new nation. So this is the very ancient times. Genesis chapter 12 is where we read about God calling Abraham. And in Genesis 13 and into 14, we have some of the lesser known stories about Father Abraham. So in Genesis 13, we read that Abraham and his nephew, who was named Lot, have both become fairly wealthy in terms of especially how much livestock they had. Because back then, wealth was often measured in property and livestock in particular, and they have so much livestock that they need to separate from one another because the land cannot support both of their herds of animals. So Abraham's nephew Lot goes away from him, and he settles near a city called Sodom. However, it seems that Lot's presence in this area and the amount of wealth he has doesn't go unnoticed. There was an ongoing war between a number of cities in that part of the ancient world, and that's recorded in Genesis chapter 14. There's a lot of complicated, weird names there that I'll spare you so you can just focus on the ones that are most important. But kind of the long and the short of this story is that the king of Sodom, where Lot lived, got defeated in this war. And the kings that were victorious came through and kind of raided and looted, and they carried off Lot and his family and all their possessions and took them prisoner. Only one guy managed to escape, and he decided he should go tell Abraham about what's going on. So off he goes, he tells Abraham, and Abraham decides he's got to go rescue his nephew. Even though Lot has been a bit of a troublesome guy, he's family. And so Abraham gathers all his hired men, all his extended family and his clan together, and they go to try to rescue Lot. And they're successful. And so they rescue Lot, they take him back to where he lived near the city of Sodom. The king of Sodom comes out, and then we get this crazy weird twist in the narrative, right? We kind of expect, it's just kind of they got taken prisoner, Abraham, his people, they were brave, they rescued him. Story has a happy ending, fairly predictable. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we get this. This is from Genesis 14, verse 18. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, and a priest of God Most High, brought Abram some bread and wine. And Melchizedek blessed Abram with this blessing: Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you. Then Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the goods that he had recovered. So Melchizedek, he kind of just comes out of nowhere. We're told that he was a king of one of these cities, but it seems that he wasn't involved in the war. I guess he was just neutral, or he was powerful enough that the other kings didn't think to take him on. I don't know. We're not told hardly anything. He just comes out of nowhere. He blesses Abraham. Abraham gives tribute to him, and then he disappears. He's never heard from again in the whole story. It's just so many questions. earlier in this series, I mentioned that the writer to the Hebrews uses some kinds of arguments that can actually be really strange or even backward to us. And this is one of those times for sure. If you ever do a class on, public speaking or logic or rhetoric or any of those things, we are often taught, and we sometimes hear, politicians and, pundits and news people accused of this, of making an argument from silence, right? Where you kind of capitalize on things that people did not say, and you kind of assume things, or you kind of make accusations about what they are really meaning, or that they're hiding something, etc., etc. But the writer to the Hebrews, and ancient Judaism generally, ancient people generally, they didn't have the same qualms about making an argument from silence. In fact, this was kind of a big thing that people like to do, and we clearly see that in this passage for today. We all sense, even as modern readers, that Melchizedek kind of comes out of nowhere. He's never heard from again. But the writer of the Hebrews, he just takes this and runs with it, right? He observes, right? Well, other characters in the book of Genesis have lengthy genealogies that talk about who their ancestors were, how they're related to people. Nothing like that about Melchizedek. So he says, well, it says he has no father or mother. It doesn't tell us about the beginning of his days when he was born. Doesn't tell us about the end of his life like it does all the other characters. He makes a really big deal out of this. And this doesn't seem to have been his own innovation either. Some Jewish sources from around this time ponder, like, why don't we get more information? Why is Melchizedek so mysterious? Some speculated that he might have been an angel or something. Some Christian thinkers throughout the ages have wondered whether Melchizedek is an appearance of Christ before the incarnation, kind of on the same category as Abraham's mysterious visitors that are going to show up in a later passage. At the end of the day, most of these remain speculations. We can't be certain about them, and Melchizedek remains a very mysterious figure. But what we can take here, and this is what the writer of Hebrews kind of concludes, is that this mysterious person, whoever he is clearly greater than even Father Abraham. If we look back at Genesis 13, we see a story where Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, one of the most powerful people in the ancient world, gives Abraham a whole bunch of stuff because he recognizes that Abraham is so blessed by God, and that Abraham is of such a stature that even the king of Egypt is giving tribute to Abraham. And then we turn around in the next chapter and we see Abraham giving tribute to this guy Melchizedek that we've never even heard of before. And as the writer of Hebrews also points out, Melchizedek blesses Abraham in a way that clearly puts Melchizedek in the role of the superior one in this relationship, in that he's giving the blessing, and it puts Abraham in the receiving position. Now, it might be helpful to just kind of look at a short timeline here by way of reminder. As I said, the story of Abraham happens way back in the book of Genesis, in the ancient times, really a couple thousand years at least before Jesus. So we have Abraham way back then, and we have this mention of Melchizedek as a priest. And then, centuries pass, and then we get kind of the story surrounding the story of the Exodus, right? This story, if you've seen the Prince of Egypt or the Ten Commandments. The Israelites are enslaved in Egypt. Moses is born. He's called to deliver his people. You get the plagues. You get the Passover. You get the Exodus from Egypt. You get the Red Sea. The giving of the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. And the rest of the stuff that happens in Exodus and Leviticus, the tabernacle, the priesthood, the sacrificial system. And then Deuteronomy and Joshua, you get the conquest of the promised land. And then more centuries pass, and eventually you get to King David and King Solomon. And then once again we hear about this priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek. In Psalm 110, King David, speaking by the Spirit of God, indicates that the priestly office or order of Melchizedek is still a thing, apparently. And or at least it's going to be a thing once again, and it's going to be a thing once again forever. So do you see what this means? If we look at kind of the order of how things are presented in the scriptures, this whole thing about Melchizedek, it kind of bookends, or it surrounds the whole thing about the priesthood descended from Levi. Right? Clearly this indicates something about the Levitical priesthood. And if we want to see like how important that was, the priesthood, like we realize that the book of the Bible called Leviticus is called Leviticus because it's about the Levites, the priests, right? They get a whole book of the Bible dedicated to how important they are to Israel, to the sacrificial system, and that they have this hereditary office that's passed from father to son, from one generation to the next. So important, and yet this thing about Melchizedek seems to come before and it seems to go on after them. Clearly this indicates something about the Levitical priesthood, and this is what the writer of the Hebrews is getting to. It indicates that it was temporary. I mean, I just think it's so interesting when we look at the timeline of this story that was just up there, right? In the time of King David and King Solomon, right, when the Levitical priesthood was kind of at its most prestigious point, they're building the temple. The temple was magnificent. And it was at that point that the Lord revealed to David that no, something different is coming. Like this is at its high point now, but something different is coming. Okay, so two things here before we go on. The priesthood of Melchizedek bookends the Levitical priesthood. It came before it, and it will continue on after it. And we find out Melchizedek was greater even than Father Abraham. So his priesthood must be greater than the one that came from Levi, who was Abraham's descendant. And the writer now turns to, okay, why is this? And this is an important question, right? At the height of the whole Israel, the temple, the priesthood, the law, did we suddenly get this mention of a different priesthood that would be eternal? I think the answer here is actually pretty simple, right? All the ins and outs and the technicalities of this passage, complicated. But the answer to what he's actually getting at, pretty simple. The Levitical priesthood and the temple in Jerusalem were never meant to be the main thing. They were only supposed to point to the main thing that was coming. And the main thing was Jesus. I've said a few times in this series, I think the greatest mistake that this congregation that's being addressed in the letter to the Hebrews, I think the greatest mistake they were making was getting this backward. They were thinking that everything they had under the old covenant, the temple, the priesthood, the sacrifices, all of that stuff, they were thinking that was the main thing, and Jesus was kind of a nice add-on that you could take or leave if you were kind of into that sort of thing. The writer of Hebrews is working really hard throughout this whole book to convince them it's actually the opposite. Jesus is the main thing, and all that stuff about the temple and the priesthood and the sacrifices was only ever supposed to point toward him. That's what he keeps going on and on about. You guys have got it backwards. What you have now in Jesus is the main thing. That was a warm-up. Now, he does say in verse 11 of chapter 7 that the people legitimately did receive the law under the old system. That's true. They received real revelation from God. And they even experienced, in some limited fashion, the presence of God in their midst in the temple under the old system. Here's the thing, and here's what Bailey was getting at with the kids. There was always something so precarious about the Old Testament priesthood, sacrifices, the temple system. Right? As I said, it was a hereditary office. It was passed on from one generation to the next. And there was never any guarantee that the next priest who would come into office would actually be a man who would truly love the Lord and seek his will and teach the people faithfully to follow God. We see many stories in the Old Testament of specific priests who were just after power and prestige and serving themselves. And we see whole eras of Israel's history where the temple worship was just horribly compromised by pagan worship. Like, the priests were supposed to teach people God's laws. They were supposed to keep the temple pure. They were supposed to do the sacrifices the right way. And in some eras of Israel's history, we read, yeah, they had a temple to the Lord, or an altar to the Lord in the temple where they'd make sacrifices to the Lord their God. And then, they happened to have another altar where they'd offer sacrifices to the pagan gods. Right? There was no guarantee that the priests were actually going to be faithful. And even if there were good priests, and from time to time the Lord did stir up revivals and such, right? If there were good priests, they would serve faithfully throughout their generation, throughout their lifespan, and then they died. And once again, the cycle would repeat itself. Is the next guy coming along? Is he going to be faithful, or is he going to turn away from the Lord? Just as verse 23 of Hebrews 7 says, even of those who were faithful, death prevented them from remaining in office. One more thing I'll point out, and then we'll kind of wrap up a bit and try to conclude this. The New Living Translation, which I read from, might obscure this a bit because the language is awkward. But in verses 11 and 15, in some translations, and certainly in the original language, it talks about a new priest or a new priesthood arising. Now, you talk about someone arising, or you talk about the rise and fall of this or that, it can just be kind of a more dramatic way, I guess, of saying that, this person arrived on the scene, right? They kind of became a thing for a time. They made an impact or whatever. But given that in this passage, the writer, where he goes with this climactic statement about Jesus having a life that cannot be destroyed, or having an indestructible life, depending on your translation, we need to consider a more technical meaning of the word. Arise, rise up. I think we kind of maybe sense where I'm going with this in English, but certainly in the original Greek that he was writing in, this isn't just any old word. This is the word that's also used for resurrection, right? For the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And I guess what I'm saying here is Jesus isn't our high priest because he just appeared on the scene one day and people thought, hey, he's pretty cool. He's our high priest forever. It says right here, in virtue of his indestructible life. Because he actually rose from the dead and he defeated death, and now he lives forever. So he can be our high priest forever. There's a lot of stuff in here that's very technical, and we could be here till Christmas. But I hope we've been able to at least trace some of the broad outlines of this. The Levitical priesthood was important. Like I said, they've got a whole book of the Bible dedicated to them. But there was something before it that seems to have been bigger. Melchizedek meeting Abraham. And furthermore, there seems to have been all along an understanding that something bigger and more important would come after. That the Levitical priesthood would eventually run its course and be replaced or be fulfilled, you might say, in what Jesus would do. Now this presents us, I think, with some difficulty, and I sense some of the difficulty in all this technical language is we just feel it's so foreign to us. Right? I've said a number of times, going back to the Jewish sacrificial system is not really a temptation for us. I mean, it's not even really a temptation for Jewish people anymore. Shortly after this letter was written, according to the usual understanding of the timeline, the Romans came and burned the temple in Jerusalem to the ground, and they never offered any more sacrifices there. So it kind of seems like, is this even really a live point? Like, it's not really an option. Here's where I think we can apply this. I think there's something inside many of us who would probably call ourselves evangelicals. We hold to a more traditional understanding of Scripture. We hold to a more orthodox understanding of the Christian faith. But sometimes that kind of, the good side of holding on to things like that is that that's good, but the bad side is that we can sometimes long for a past when we think things were better. Psychologists sometimes talk about things like, personality traits having a shadow side. And I think sometimes it's true of theological traits or doctrinal beliefs. A strong conviction that we must hold on to the faith we've received as we've received it can sometimes lead to beliefs that nothing must ever change. Things were better in the past. There's this golden age that we kind of long to get back to. And sometimes there's even truth in that impulse, right? This is not to say that there weren't good things that happened in the past, right? God has done amazing things in the past. If we think about the history of our own community over the generations, God answered prayers. God moved in power. God built his kingdom. Lives were changed. Deliverance was found. Whether we want to look at our own community, whether we want to look at Christianity more general in Western culture, whatever, God really worked in powerful ways in the past. But those programs, structures, systems, methods, even if they're God-ordained and God-blessed and beloved and apparently effective in their day, none of those things save us. None of those things are eternal. And as much as any program or structure or system or style or any well-loved thing may point us to Jesus, they may be helpful means of experiencing his grace, and that's good, and we should rejoice in that. But if ever any of these things become ends in themselves, we're in serious danger. We've talked at some length over these last few weeks about the perfect and eternal and once-for-all work of Jesus that allows us to come into the presence of God. And one of the most profound ways we can do that and experience that is in celebrating the Lord's Supper together. There are different ways and means believers have done this over the centuries, probably different ways that we've celebrated this in our own lives, in different churches we've been a part of even. Right? And as I said, sometimes the style, sometimes the specific ways and means we do that is beloved, and sometimes it changes. But the truth and the reality of what we are celebrating, that's what does not change. That's what remains forever, because Jesus is our high priest who remains forever. And in gathering and celebrating the Lord's Supper, friends, we are celebrating and remembering and proclaiming the once-for-all sacrifice of Jesus that brings us to God. We're celebrating and remembering his eternal high priesthood on the basis of his risen and indestructible life. And so we're going to prepare to celebrate the Lord's Supper in just a moment. And so I'd invite our worship team back up.